Hi! If you are new here, all you need to know is that I have watched the first season of the One Piece live-action adaptation, and now, for the first time ever, I am reading the manga, and, more specifically, the first 100 chapters that the live-action has covered so far. With all of that said, let's begin! Chapter 2. They call him Straw Hat Luffy. So, this chapter begins with Luffy getting sucked into a giant whirlpool, and his demeanor made me want to roll on the ground. With a giant smile on his face, he was just chilling and telling himself, "Oh well, can't be helped, down I go." Recently, I learned this Australian slang, a loose unit, and I immediately thought that it described the live-action version of Luffy perfectly. Now I know that apparently he seems even crazier in the source material. If I hadn't seen the live-action and already fallen in love with Luffy's character there, I think the manga would have done a very quick and wonderful job to endear me to him. Next, we are introduced to Alvida, and I love how it's done here. At first, we only get to see her face partially, and the image is warped by how she sees herself, this beautiful, lovely woman. Then, we get the jump scare of her actual design. Details like these might seem small in the grand scheme of things, but I believe it's precisely the small details that either elevate any story or bring it down. Next, we have the scene where Luffy meets Koby. I adore the reveal that Koby has a secret boat he's built over the course of 2 years to escape Alvida, but he doesn't have the courage to try it. His arc in the live action revolved around him learning to find that courage and confidence to take action. So, building a boat yet not using it sets up that future arc perfectly clearly in just a few panels. I think this is very effective storytelling. Then Luffy calls Koby clumsy, dumb, gutless, and worthless with that same grin on his face. In the manga, he seems much blunter than in the live action. He's not trying to be maliciously mean and rude, but he absolutely destroyed Koby here. Then we get a small but key difference in Koby's characterization compared to the live action. In the show, he had to be pushed quite a lot by other characters, like Luffy constantly encouraging him or Garp trying to force some action out of him. In the manga, while Luffy inspires Koby, he does so indirectly, and I think that's a very important difference. Koby comes to the conclusion that he also wants to follow his dream on his own, and once Alvida shows up again, Koby stands up to her himself instead of getting pulled along by Luffy like they did it in the live action. This makes Koby a much more active character than his counterpart in the live action, and that is always a good thing. I already really liked Koby in the live action, but I can see myself absolutely loving him in the manga. The last note I have about the second chapter is that I find it interesting how, in the manga, Luffy decides to seek out Zoro after only hearing about him, while in the live action it was more of a chance meeting. I think both versions work, only in different ways. The only thing that remains the same is Luffy's criteria for joining. Is this person good? And that is the core thing, even if the circumstances differ. Let's move on to Chapter 3. Enter Zoro, Pirate Hunter. Just like they showed it in the live action, Luffy's priorities are clear. Eat first, everything else comes after that. So, Luffy and Koby find themselves in a restaurant, and Eiichiro noticed an interesting detail. In the background, there is a wanted poster for someone named Mikio. The exact same poster was also in Chapter 1, but I think I didn't mention that in my previous review. My first thought was that it must be foreshadowing for a future character. But then I thought that it's odd that the same poster appears in such a close proximity to the first one. It seems like an overkill for a simple setup. The whole point of foreshadowing is subtlety, but there's nothing subtle about this. Then I thought that another possibility might be that this is some kind of an Easter egg that I don't get yet. I don't remember which story it was, but I once read a manga where the author put the team around him into the drawings. So people like the editor, the assistant, and a few others appeared as background characters. So, in One Piece, other than a setup for a future character, my second best guess is that this wanted poster of Mikio is a similar Easter egg. But I guess only time will tell. Zoro's introduction plays out differently, but the essence stays the same. What the live action did was simply combining a few separate scenes into one. One thing that stood out to me in a very good way was the fact that the manga version of Zoro ate all of the rice balls, or as Luffy put it, dirt balls, even if the little girl wasn't even present in that scene to see that. He only asked Luffy to give a message to the girl that the rice balls were delicious and that he ate it all. Zoro could have asked Luffy to pass on the same message without actually eating the destroyed food. Sure, Luffy wouldn't have lied, but Zoro didn't know that at that point. I think this complete honesty plus the girl's story were the first steps in convincing Luffy to invite Zoro to his crew. The final nail in the coffin, in my opinion, was the fact that Zoro genuinely believed in Helmeppo's promise. You have to be an honest person yourself to so blindly believe in someone else's honesty. The last note I have is about Helmeppo. In the live action, his haircut was Zoro's idea, but in the manga, as it turns out, that monstrosity of a bowl cut was a voluntary choice, and I find that very funny. Next we have Chapter 4, The Great Captain Morgan. One thing that immediately stands out is that this Luffy is much pushier. He just decided that Zoro is going to be on his crew, and he doesn't take no from him as an answer. In the live action, what convinced Zoro to help Luffy was the exact opposite thing. It was the fact that Luffy didn't push at all. He just made his offer, and after hearing a no, still untied Zoro and just left. This makes it clear that some aspects of Luffy's characterization are different in the manga and the live action. I can see how some people, especially hardcore fans, may not like it, but I am not a purist when it comes to adaptations. I think it's okay to change some events or even characterizations as long as the heart of the story and the characters stay the same. What matters is that the adaptation still makes sense as its own thing, and the One Piece TV show succeeded in that aspect. Another thing I want to talk about is that Helmeppo keeps repeating how he's never been hit. I might be overanalyzing things once again, but this repetition gives me the impression that this will somehow come back specifically in the manga. Something like Helmeppo learning to take hits and then fight back. Next, let's talk about the man this chapter is named after, Axe-Hand Morgan. He is so much worse than he was portrayed in the live action. The scene where he kills a marine for refusing his order to kill a child reminded me of the live action Garp. The manga version of Morgan believes that rank means everything, while the live action Garp believed that it's following a personal code, despite the official orders, is what makes a good marine. I don't know how Garp will be characterized in the manga, and I know it makes little sense to draw parallels between different versions of the story, but I couldn't help but be reminded of that scene in the live action as I read this scene in the manga. After Luffy causes some healthy amount of chaos and grabs Helmeppo, we get a scene that, for me, was probably the most surprising thing in the manga so far. I am talking about Kobe and Zoro scene. For some reason, I did not expect it at all for these two to interact one-on-one, but I loved this scene. Kobe continues being much more active character compared to his live-action counterpart by going to untie Zoro simply because he believes he was arrested unfairly. Another thing that took me by surprise a bit is that Kobe actually got shot here. I am curious to see how this injury will be handled in the next chapters. The last chapter I'll review today is Chapter 5, The King of the Pirates and the Master Swordsman. First of all, Luffy continues to be ruthless and a much more extreme version of his live-action counterpart. He was dragging and punching Helmeppo with no mercy, and when the guards told him to put him down or they would shoot, Luffy, in a very Luffy fashion, simply stated, "I don't want to," before using Helmeppo as a shield, even if bullets would do nothing to him either way. Each chapter makes me fall in love with this protagonist more and more, and that's just the very beginning of the massive story. Next, the interaction between Zoro and Kobe continues, and Zoro seems really touched when he hears that Luffy stood up for him. Then Kobe gives a beautiful speech about Luffy, and I think Zoro found it very convincing. When someone talks so highly about another person while that person in question isn't present, you know it's probably true. I think that here, Zoro was already halfway to accepting Luffy's offer. The main thing we get this chapter is Zoro's backstory, and it's a lot to unpack, especially when I compare it to the live action. In the show, in the Syrup Village arc, I'll admit that I really disliked the circumstances of how Zoro ended up in a well. First, he was knocked out by a bottle of wine over his head, which makes perfect sense if we are going the more realistic route. But then Zoro was dropped down a deep well, and that, apparently, wasn't a big deal at all. Not a single bone broken. That's the first contradiction and inconsistency. Another thing that also bothered me was that those cat pirates didn't bother to make sure that Zoro was truly dead before throwing him into that well. It felt like the writers of the show simply needed Zoro to go from point A to point B and didn't think too deeply about the journey between those 2 points. However, the actual sequence of events inside the well was one of my favorite parts of the entire season. The cuts between the backstory and Zoro's struggle to climb out were done beautifully, and I could really feel how much that one promise meant to Zoro. Reading the manga didn't change the fact that I still loved that scene, but it completely flipped my interpretation and theories. First of all, after watching the show, I was convinced that Kuina is either still alive or the circumstances of her death would somehow play a bigger role later in the story. Another thing is that I was really suspicious of the teacher. I thought he was either lying or even had something to do with Kuina's death directly. Now I can safely throw those theories out of the window. The teacher apparently was Kuina's father, and the accident was truly just an accident, simply falling down the stairs. The fact that it was so simple and quick was so much more brutal than any theory I had after watching the live action. And Zoro's reaction broke my heart, because he was screaming in a very childish manner how Kuina was running away from the promise. Basically, my conclusion is that the manga version of this backstory was less dramatic than the live action, but more brutal. While I like both, to me it feels like the live action version was a bit of a misdirection. The chapter ends with Luffy saving Zoro and Kobe from the bullets. The fact that Luffy saved Zoro's life so that he can continue chasing his and Kuina's dream was the exact thing that finally convinced Zoro to accept Luffy's offer. And I also think it was the thing that planted a seed that would eventually grow into an unwavering loyalty. And on that note, I'll finish this review. Thank you for listening. share your own thoughts in the comments. And if you are interested, I'll see you in the next part as I review the next batch of chapters.